Is your bike bogging out? Let's take care of that. So this really only applies to bikes with carburetors, either a 2-stroke or a 4-stroke. If you have a fuel-injected bike, it's most likely your fuel pump or your fuel filter. So the first and easiest thing to check is going to be your fuel screw. On this bike, the fuel screw is located right up here in the front of the carburetor. Kind of hard to get to. So I'm going to have to loosen up the carburetor and rotate it to get to that screw. So I've got the carburetor tilted a little bit, and now I can get access to the screw right here. This is going to be your fuel mixture screw. I'm going to start out by seeing how many turns out this fuel screw is. I'm going to go all the way in. We're at half, 1, 1.5. So it's about 1 3/4. So that is somewhat in the range for where it should be. But I am going to put it to 2 out and see if that makes a difference. Rotate this carburetor back into place and tighten it up. Having the fuel screw at 2 turns out didn't really seem to change much. So I went all the way in and then pretty far out, like 3 turns out, and nothing really seemed to change. So the fuel screw really isn't the issue here. And as far as where you should have the fuel screw, 2 to 2.5 turns out is about optimal. Another quick and easy thing to check is the spark plug. So I'm going to pull it out, wire brush it, torch it to burn off any oil, and see if that makes a difference at all. So this plug looks pretty good. Doesn't have tons of oil buildup, nor is it white or extremely black, indicating a rich or severe lean condition. So the plug is all cleaned up, and while it's out, it doesn't hurt to check the gap as well. Spark plug didn't really make a difference, so the next thing I'm going to do is pull apart the carburetor, make sure the jets aren't plugged up, and also check over the float height and some of the gaskets and seals in there as well. So if I pull the carburetor off the boots and tilt it, I should be able to get to these float bowl screws, and then I can get access to those jets and check the float height too. The first few things we're going to check out are the jets. So we have the main jet right here, and then the pilot jet is right up inside this hole. So I'm going to pop these out and see if they're blocked. The most common reason for a bike to bog is a plug pilot jet. So the longer jet right here is the pilot jet, and any small piece of dirt or grit that gets in there is going to plug it up and cause the bike to bog out. Now it's time to see if these jets are plugged up. The easiest way to do this is to hold them up to a light source, and if they're clear, you'll be able to see light coming through them. So it looks like both jets are clear. You can see how small that pilot jet hole is. It is super tiny. If you do have a plug jet, an easy way to clear it out is by using compressed air. So here I've got a duster can, or if you have an air compressor, that works even better. So the jets aren't the problem. One more thing we're going to check inside the carburetor is the float height. Before I measure the float height, I'm going to have to figure out what the correct spec is. So usually jumping on Google and doing some searching will provide you with that info. For some reason, Yamaha decided not to release a spec for measuring the float height manually. So I've got a different way of going about it. Alright, here's how I'm going to check the float height. So you want the carburetor somewhat level, and then pull up on the floats and then let them settle. So right there they're settled, but you don't want them pushing down the pin at all. So that would be pushing down the pin. and right there is settled. When you have the float settled right here in this position, you want to have the float bowl line and the line on the floats parallel. And it looks like this one isn't quite parallel, so it's going to need some adjusting. To adjust the float height, this little tab right here has to be bent up or down. As it sits right now, the float height is set too high, since the floats and the float bowl line are not parallel. So I'm going to have to bend this tab upwards to correct that. So it's as simple as getting a small screwdriver and pushing on the tab right here. And it doesn't take much to adjust it. It's a pretty weak tab. So how floats can get out of adjustment is just over time, them bouncing up and down, over many years. That'll throw it out of whack. And then also, when you're pulling off the float bowl, the floats and the bowl are pretty close to each other. And if you catch the floats when you're pulling off the bowl, it could set that float height out of adjustment. All right, time to check this float height once again. Gonna pull up on the floats, let them settle. And that looks pretty parallel right there. So here's a little better angle of how it should look. So we've got the float bowl line, the line on the floats. It's got to make sure they're parallel. So I'm going to settle the floats right there, and they look pretty parallel. So it's good to go. I'm going to put this carburetor back together. If you do have the float height spec, here's how to measure it. You're going to go from the float bowl mounting surface to the line on the floats. So you're going to want to get the float settled right there, and then measure from here to here. I guess I never really went into much detail about how float height changes how a bike runs. So how this was set up before, the float height was too high and letting too much fuel into the carburetor. And a good indicator of that is when you tip the bike over a little bit, fuel will run out of the bottom of the carburetor. So that's when you have a float height too high. And when it's too low, it won't allow enough fuel into the carburetor and cause it to run lean. In this case, the float height was set too high, causing a rich condition, and fuel would also drip out of the carburetor when I tilted the bike on its side. Before I put the rest of this carburetor back together, I need to do some more explaining on the fuel screw and the jets. So like I was saying earlier, optimal fuel screw position is about 2 to 2.5 turns out. That's about where you want it. And so if your bike runs best at, say, 3 turns out, then you need to go up on your pilot jet, which is the smaller jet inside this hole right here. And then on the contrary, if your bike runs best at, say, 1 turnout or half a turnout, then you need to go smaller on the pilot jet. All right, time for the real test. Let's see how she runs. So she runs pretty good. The bog has pretty much been eliminated, but with any carbureted bike, you're always gonna have a little hesitation there, but it runs so much better now. If you've already gone through everything I showed in the video, the spark plug, the fuel screw, making sure the jets are clear, and the float height, and you still have a bog, there's a variety of other things it could be as well, but these are just the most common scenarios. So I would go through, check your valve adjustment, make sure you have fresh gas, clean air filter. If your bike has a fuel filter, make sure that's clear. And what else could it be? You could also check for air leaks or a plugged exhaust system, but these are pretty unlikely scenarios. I hope this video helped some of you guys out. If you enjoyed watching it and found some good info in it, hit subscribe right up here. I'll see you guys later.